So introducing our next speaker, one of the things I was going to say about STEPH is, I'm pleased to say she uses Gigi Raptor. But there's a few other interesting things about her. One thing which is sort of, well, we kind of expected from our speakers, yes, she's got a PhD in econometrics. Now it gets interesting. Her undergraduate was in Latin. So there I was having coffee with her, talking about Marcus Aurelius, as it happens, Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Oh, I studied Latin, you know, she said. Well, that was interesting. Possibly even more interesting is the name of her company, through which she does some rather interesting consulting to government and...
You're giving all my secrets away, Eugene.
Well, this is the ultimate secret. Her company is named after her rabbit. Rex Annalise is named after a rabbit, whose name is not Rex. Okay, Rex is the breed of rabbit. The name of the rabbit is Carrot, which I claim is named after an alpaca. Well, over to Steph.
So tonight I'd like to talk to you about Tales from Far Off Places, which is my experiences working with the World Bank's early grade reading programs from 2012 to 2015. And there were definitely some of the more interesting work that I've done in my career, and hopefully you'll find it interesting too. So to start off, I'd like to talk about credit where it's due. The programs and the projects I'll tell you about tonight were definitely a team effort, and I wasn't the team captain, and I sure wasn't the star player either. These projects relied on many experts from the World Bank, including education and in-country experts, linguists, expert sampling, statistician and behavioural economists, just to name a few. Now, as much as I enjoyed working with my teammates and I respected them highly, they'd be the first people to tell you that they weren't the heroes of these tales from far off places. And there were people who did heroic things to get these happening. The real heroes were the in-country teams, the enumerators, teachers, ministry employees and advocates who were all passionate promoters of local education and local languages. They each of them believed very strongly in the right of every child to learn to read. Now, suffice it to say, this presentation doesn't represent the views of the World Bank. They're just mine. So, to start off with a little background, I think we can all probably be pretty clear that education is a critical part of developing economies. Learning to read underpins everything that comes afterwards. The World Bank funds programs across the Pacific to improve not only education outcomes, but also health and human protection. And the programs I'll tell you about tonight were funded by organisations like the Global Partnership for Education, of which Julia Gillard is now the chairperson, also AusAid and NZAid. So, learning to read isn't easy. We know that here in Australia, where everything's pretty good. In a developing country, it's even more so. And there's lots of reasons why learning to read may not be easy. Those might include linguistic reasons. For example, in Papua New Guinea, where we did a lot of work, there are over 700 native languages. Children might be coming to school to learn to read in English, but that's not their second language. That may be their third or their fourth language. These kids had cracking linguistic skills, but learning to read under those circumstances isn't always easy. The other issue may be socioeconomic. If you are the only person in your family that's ever gone to school, or you haven't eaten adequately, we're not really surprised if that child may not be performing to their full potential. So that makes it hard to learn to read. The other issue might be resources. In Laos, we did some studies on different schools, having a look at where things were going well and where things weren't. We found schools without electricity. We found schools without toilets. We found a school with a hole in the floor of the classroom. The classroom was on the second story. So the question really isn't why aren't kids learning to read better? The problem more is how can we improve outcomes efficiently and with appropriate deference to local needs and leadership. The people working on the ground already know what community needs are. They've got a pretty good idea of what local priorities are. So our purpose was to work with them to get data to make decisions that would improve reading outcomes for their students. So the first step in any process like this is to find out what we don't know. And it turns out we didn't know a hell of a lot. And we didn't know a lot in a lot of countries. I worked on studies in Papua New Guinea, Tonga, Timor-Leste, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos and Vanuatu during my time at the bank. And it has to be said, I sat at a desk mostly. There were other people that did the hero stuff, that were going off to far off places and fording rivers and taking backpacks and go testing children. And I produced two things for the team. That would be unbiased estimation, where it's possible, and charts. Mostly they like the charts. Unfortunate but true. So this is my tales from far off places, but it's also my tale because my background was that I have a PhD in theoretical econometrics. I specialised in time series and panel data, and when I joined the World Bank team to do the analysis and modelling for their projects that they were putting together, I thought I knew everything I needed to know to do that job. Not so much. So this is really the tale about how I transitioned out of my very comfortable theoretical bubble and into the rather more wild and more complex world of applied work. So tonight I'll tell you about the early grade reading programs. I'll tell you about how our team designed studies that were culturally, linguistically and contextually appropriate. I'll tell you about the modelling and analysis that we did and what we found out from that. And then I'll tell you what we did with all of that data. And there was a lot of data. FYI, by our standards, a lot of data was a sample with 3,500 kids, so you can all call me adorable. Okay, big data is not something we ever dealt with. Now, how do you design a study to measure reading? It's not like we're trying to measure something that we can really concrete sit down and say, this is what reading is. What does reading look like in an Australian school? Possibly Spot went to the park, that would look like reading. What does it look like in Lao? Lao is a language with over 300 syllables, each represented by a different character. What does it look like in Tongan, a language that has only 24 letters, a glottal stop, and is fully transparent? So early grade reading is something that is different in every country and every context. What we used was something called the Early Grade Reading Assessment, which was developed by the Research Triangle Institute in the US, and that takes a skills-based approach. An enumerator sits with a student for about 15 to 20 minutes and looks at the different sub-skills that make up reading in that language and in that country. It looks at things like letter recognition, sound and phoneme recognition, sight words and decoding, connecting a text and comprehension of that text, and it also looks at things like listening and writing skills. Now, because this is an interview and not a written test, it's suitable for very young children whose reading skills are only just beginning to develop. We don't want a situation where, yes, the kid got the wrong answer, but was it because they couldn't read the question, because they didn't understand the question, because they couldn't write the answer, or because they didn't know what the answer was? So that's why it's an interview. And it takes a long time. So in order to set about to design this study, we have to decide what's appropriate in these different contexts. We need to consider linguistics, which, as I've mentioned, is different in every place we go to. We need to consider culture. I went to the snow and I played on my iPod in the car. Would be quite a suitable phrase for my child here in Australia to learn to read. Is it suitable for a kid in Cambodia? The snow and the iPod thing, doesn't really make sense to them. So we have to consider the culture and the linguistic and educational exposures these kids have had in order to come up with something that's sensible and robust. So we had to sit down and create an instrument in every country and every language that we went to. And this was something that happened mostly before I got to the team. The first EGRA in the Pacific was in 2009 in Tonga, shortly followed by 2 EGRAs in English and French in Vanuatu. The PNG instrument was put together in 2010, 2011, and when I joined the team in 2012, the Lao instrument was well underway. So how do you decide what common sight words there are in each language and context? Well, text mining would make sense. Simple term frequency in the readers and in the school sports support materials should give us a pretty robust idea of what these kids are actually exposed to. Except this was 2009 to 2012, and as far as I'm aware, no one on the project could code before I got there. So when I say text mining the hard way, it was really hard. So these teams, and this was one of the extraordinary things that they did, they sat there for weeks at a time and read the local equivalent of Spot Goes to the Park and noted down every word and every letter and worked out what the term frequency was across the entire syllabus in every country. I don't know how they managed that. I don't know how they didn't go crazy, but they did it and it was extraordinary. So they put together this instrument and they did a good job of it. Once we had an instrument, we had to prepare it. It went into piloting stage in a local school where we'd check for internal validity using Cronbach's alpha, and we learnt the hard way that we had to test it for each subsample as well as each sample as well. Then we had to train the enumerators, who were generally teachers for students from the local teaching college. And they would go out into the field, and we had to train them in order to deliver this in a consistent and relevant way every time. And inter-rater reliability had to be organised and appropriate. So once we had an instrument, we needed a sample. And each of these countries has a lot of very remote and difficult to access areas. In one case, we were doing a randomised control trial, and out we went to a particular region in Madang. Teams went out at baseline, all good. By the time we got to end line, we could no longer send people out there. It was too dangerous. The yearly storms had set in, and they stayed in until the school year was over. So we lost an entire region from our randomised control trial. It did all sorts of things to our power. There was much wailing and gnashing of teeth, but you know, no data is worth sending someone out to die for. Well. So generally speaking, we were working with the local ministries, and so it was really up to them what they wanted out of their data. We used stratified cluster sampling based on their requirements, and this would be a back and forth thing. So in the Lao baseline in 2012, I carefully created a sampling list, I created a replacement list, and then someone changes their mind. So I created a sampling list, I created a new replacement list, and I was still naming this final analysis, by the way. That was a lesson learned. And then someone would change their mind, and back and back and back we'd go. Eventually, we sent them out with a final analysis, sampling and replacement list. And 2 weeks later, I hear about how it went. Did you get to every school on the list? No. Okay, how many did you take from the replacement list? No, we didn't use the replacement list. You went off list? So, cool, calm oceans, calm blue oceans, it's all fine. Why did you go off list? Well, there was a flood, and the team leader was worried somebody would drown because they were crossing the river on foot. Okay. So that made for an interesting footnote to that one. And I realised that random sampling sometimes comes from a random number generator, and sometimes shit just happens. So we had data. We had lots of data. In addition to the EGRA methodology, we also had student surveys, we had teacher context surveys, and we had specialist classroom observations. And this was when I came to an interesting conclusion. I had a PhD in econometrics. I had like 8-9 years training in modelling, and about 2 weeks for data analysis, and guess where I spent all of my time? So data analysis became my life because nobody cared about the models. And at the end of the day, that was about communication. You can't go to a minister and say, I have a nerd, she did a model. You can go to the minister with a bar chart and say, hey look, kids aren't reading, can we have some money please? So really, the data analysis part of my job at the bank was about telling a story and making a case and trying to convince people that they should care about these results, about these data, about this issue, and by extension, these kids. And it required me to learn a whole new skill set, because when it came to dry academic jargon, I was a champion. When it came to communicating with ordinary human beings, yeah, that was a challenge. So I had to learn to write again and to communicate with people who didn't necessarily have a PhD in econometrics, with whom I seemed to spend an awful lot of time. So after that, it was time to get a bit technical, and this was always my favourite part. One of the reasons why we were collecting all this data was in order to then go on and intervene and try and make changes. It's all very well to come up with a data set that says kids aren't reading well enough, this is a problem. But one of the things we wanted to do was see, with all of these observations that we were making, what was associated with reading success and what was not. So my business was in explaining relationships, not in prediction. And while those two things are very much related, they're not the same. And that defined my modelling approach. The other issue was, except in very specific circumstances, these models couldn't give us any indication of causality. I could not say that if you do X, then Y will happen. If this child is speaking top percent in the home, then we would expect that they will have a 0.02% less reading score. That's not where we were up to. We were surveying kids between ages of 7 and 9 years old, generally speaking. And as I put it to the non-technical people, after I'd learned to speak their language, it's like trying to nail jelly to a wall. There's a big splatter radius. So the problem I had from the outset was, how can we model test score data with large proportions of 0 scores? One of the things we were very careful in putting these instruments together and piloting them for was, we didn't want a ceiling effect where the test is so easy every kid gets 100%. And we didn't want a floor effect where it's so hard that nobody can score higher than 0. We needed something in the middle. And one of the things we found was that on sort of simpler skills, things like letter recognition, kids were doing okay. Generally speaking, most kids could name a few letters. There were better and there was worse, but it was what it was. When it came to things like reading a connected text or comprehending that text, we had a large proportion of students who were scoring 0. And that was a consistent issue across all of the countries that I worked in. And that's why we were there. So the question was, how can we model this appropriately so we can see what's good about what's there already and what needs to be improved? So if we consider reading skill a latent variable, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that concept before. So an unobserved variable, and we can only observe subtest data at 0 and above. All possible parts of the sampling distribution are being sampled, but we can only observe at 0 and greater. And that's a case of censoring. Now, ordinary least squares regression assumes continuous data. And when I got to the team, the analysis method was to do a simple linear regression on each variable of interest and then just move on. The problem with that is that it's biased in the presence of censored and truncated data, and I felt that was a naive view we could possibly improve on. The Tobit model, on the other hand, accounts for censored data. So based on the data analysis that we'd done, I'd then make a decision about functional form for the model. Now, practically speaking, does it matter? That was something I had to ask myself over and over again. In my theoretical bubble, it all mattered all the time. In applied work, when you might have half a day, maybe 2 days if I was really lucky, to get these models out, sometimes I had to make decisions about what was good enough for today. And I don't know if anybody else here works in applied work, but I think we've all made those good enough for today decisions at times. I felt in this particular case it was definitely worth making the case for a better functional form because I found at around 20% censoring, the OLS model is really not looking so crash hot, and the Tobit offered a much, much better fit. The other question I had to look at was system versus one-by-one estimation. Depending on the country, we had between 7 and 8 subtests to deal with, not all of which were worth spending time modelling on. I mean, things like, letter recognition. Can a kid recognise A, B and C were of less relevance than can a kid read this passage? But a lot of them we did want to model. One by one fails to use the variation between these related tests, these correlations. For example, a kid that can't recognise A, B and C on a page probably isn't writing very well. And so one by one, system estimation allows for a much more nuanced modelling capability. And the method I like to use here was the seemingly unrelated modalities. You've probably heard of seemingly unrelated regression. I was using a combination of Tobit and regression models for these. Feature selection was another big issue. I mean, we had hundreds of variables and, there's thousands of permutations. Do you throw everything in there and kind of hope for the best? Well, on a really bad good enough a day, sure. But when we had more time, it makes more sense to take a much more nuanced approach here. In this case, data analysis matters. I don't know about anybody else, but I find in applied work, trying to impress people with data analysis is a bit like trying to impress them with a doorknob. They're everywhere. We all use them all the time. There's nothing special about them, but take the doorknob away and you can't open the door. So data analysis informed everything that came afterwards. Marginal effects was another critical issue, particularly on the latent variable. So for instance, do I expect a linear relationship between two variables, or was it something more subtle? For example, age, I'd expect to have a levelling off here. A kid who's very young for their grade may be struggling, whereas a kid who's a bit older, you wouldn't expect them to be doing a lot better. For example, it should probably level off. This was particularly important in Papua New Guinea, where we'd surveyed kids in grades 2, 3 and 4, and we had kids in grade 3 who had ages ranging from 9 to 16. Universal basic education was a fairly new thing in Papua New Guinea, and a kid who is 16 years old and in grade 3 is there because they have had no other educational opportunities in their life before that. So these sorts of things mattered when it came to modelling this data. Interactions was something I also used a lot of, and I used it very thoroughly, particularly in early stages of modelling, to tease out what kind of issues were important in which subsample. So for example, in Tonga and in most countries, we found that kids who reported that somebody reads to them at home were probably doing better at reading than those who didn't. In Tonga though, this was actually a sex-linked issue and it had a different effect for boys than girls. And interactions told us why that was. Now, it's always possible when you've got hundreds of variables and thousands of permutations just to throw in everything that looks like it might work, take out the bits that are insignificant and call it a day. And, you know, when timelines press, what can you do? It's good enough for today. When you've got a bit more time, I found the general to specific method. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that. That's where we test down sequentially in groups using a Lagrange multiplier or Vold test. Gave me a better model in the end. Doing it the other way actually creates a compound hypothesis test of unknown size. So better statistical rigour was gained that way, and the resulting model was very lean. It avoided overfitting, and it also gave it the chance for the data to speak for itself. So I did a lot of models, and I had a lot of data. Well, by our standards, we had a lot of data, but when you have to sit there for 15 minutes for every student, it's a lot of data. The factors that were associated with reading success were different in every country and in every particular study that we did, but there were a few common themes. And student factors like does somebody read to you at home and socioeconomic factors were definitely significant across different countries. Language was another issue. I became a believer in mother tongue education, where we teach children to read in the language that they are most familiar with. It's not always possible in countries with hundreds and hundreds of languages, but where it was, I found that there was good evidence for it on the ground. Teachers were the strong link between reading and kids. Teachers could make a huge difference. Things like formal training and qualifications didn't always give us a clear picture, but classroom management practices and things that we observed from there informed the next stage of these studies. School factors, resources were a big issue. You know, if there's no toilets, there's no electricity, if there's no paper, if there's no books, we can see why that's an issue. School communities also had a role to play in order to improve outcomes for kids. So we did a lot of modelling, we did a lot of data analysis, we did a lot of data collection. What did they do with it? The whole point was to come up with locally developed reading programs that would improve outcomes in these different countries. So in 2013 and 2014, there were 2 randomised controlled trials testing teacher-based interventions in Papua New Guinea. The World Bank, the wheels turn at their own paces. The results haven't been published yet, but you know, things were looking pretty good. There's also the Pacific Early Age Reading and Learning Project in Tonga, which was a census-level study carried out in 2014, and the Tongan Early Human Capability Index, or TECI for short, was also deployed for preschool students in 2014. They're currently at midline in 2 concurrent trials for preschool and school-aged children, and from what I hear, things are looking pretty good. There were also further studies in Laos, Myanmar and Tuvalu planned, so it's all systems go for reading in the Pacific. Thank you very much for listening to my tales from far off places. I'll open the floor to questions.
Are there any questions?
I have one.
There we go.
So I was trying to follow. Did you ask the same the kids to read the same text?
We can't translate a text from language to language because what's an early grade sight word for Lao won't be the same in, say, Papua New Guinea. But generally speaking, the text went along something like the lines of, the dictation text was, I went to the store to buy some rice and sugar in Papua New Guinea. The text was developed by linguists in country for each one for the reading, so that it would be appropriate. So it would have been something on the level of Spot goes to the park in each individual language.
Hi, in the model you made, what were the most important, variables that you
The most important variables generally covered things that we couldn't intervene on, things like socioeconomics, the language that a child spoke at home. So in Papua New Guinea, if a child reported speaking English at home, that was relatively rare, but those kids were performing far and away better on an English reading test, which came as a huge surprise to everybody. Whereas kids who were speaking Tok Pisin at home, which is basically your local lingua franca, they would be sort of next down, and the kids that were speaking Tok Place, which is like a village, very, very localised language, they would often be performing at the lowest rung. Other issues were things like school resources. So in Laos, there was a very, very clear delineation. The top quartile of schools had electricity and toilets, and teacher turnover was low, and interesting gender in teaching staff was a little bit different as well. Whereas in the bottom quartile of schools in Laos, no toilets, no electricity, and that was a very stark difference.
It looks to me that you have done a hierarchical ordinance for each individual country.
No, actually, generally just speaking, so I had about 2 days at most to do all modelling. So that was just a bog standard Tobit model or a seemingly unrelated regression model. So hierarchical clustering, for example, would have some definite benefits here. We didn't get time to do that. I'm hoping some PhD student sometime gets a hold of this data and really gets into it.
Hierarchical linear modelling?
We didn't do any of that, but again, I think it would have real potential.
Right.
Yep.
One more question. Have you combined all data together and estimated a model of all data you have?
Probably a linguist would have a heart attack. So these EGRA models are not directly comparable between countries and even within countries for language because, for example, there's this theory that kids need to be reading at about 45 correct words per minute in a connected text in order to get about 70% reading comprehension in English. But that's not, for example, the case in Lao, where it is in fact much lower. So, yeah, the linguists, I used to come up with these models and say, look what I did, and they go, no. So, yeah, that happened a few times.
Thank you for the talk. Why did you have such a short time to create the models?
Timelines. Generally speaking, everything, was probably my most important lesson from applied work, and that is everything takes longer than we think it's going to take. So I'd get the data, usually about 6 weeks after they said it would be, and then they'd say, we need a full report, and I'd say, yeah, that's fine, and I'd say, how long do we have to do it? It has 2 weeks. And so all data analysis would have to be done and finalised. And I've still got reports that I wrote in 2012 that haven't been published yet, so I'm not quite sure why timelines had to be like that, but that was actually how it happened. So, yeah.
Question. Yeah, so like we have quite a few countries where people are highly literate.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of know what it takes to teach people how to read.
Mm-hmm.
Which, as you said, as you found as well, socioeconomics and, having well-funded schools.
It's a great start.
Like
yeah.
Toilets in schools. So, like maybe I missed it at the start, but what was the question that the World Bank was hoping to answer with this research? Given that, put more money into education, you get better results.
Yeah, it's generally the way it goes.
Yeah, so...
What they were looking for was evidence to inform future interventions on a country-by-country basis. So, for example, there's this theory, has anybody ever heard of whole word versus phonics approach for learning to read? Okay, so there's various arguments on both sides. There was a belief that phonics, in a situation where kids may not be perfectly familiar with the language they are learning to read, might be the best approach. So what they wanted to do was, these were baseline studies to see what was going on, just to get that whole sort of CT scan idea, what's going on. And from there, they decided to go with a phonics approach, and that was where the randomised controlled trials came in. So,
when you were talking about some of the factors of success, when you were talking about some of the factors for success in reading, you talked about classroom management.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about that term classroom management, do you specifically mean the teacher's behaviour management within the classroom, or are you talking about their management of learning? So, for example, differentiating the content of the lesson, for example.
That's actually a bit of a catch-all. So what we also deployed along with the EGRA was something called the classroom observational snapshot, where a numerator would sit in on a classroom and observe a class for maybe half an hour or so. And during that period, they'd be looking at the languages spoken in the classroom, they'd be looking at teacher behaviour, they'd be looking at what was going on in the classroom. Are there books in the classroom, is there printed text, things like that. And then they'd go ahead and look at the teacher's lesson plan and just try and estimate how often a teacher may have been, say, doing phonics, or they may have been doing dictation. Dictation was a really common activity. In Lao particular, we actually deployed another survey to look at how teachers behaved and get students to give us their perspective. One thing we did note was a teacher who was reported by young students to hit or yell at the kids. This wasn't a positive outcome on reading scores. So that was a very catch-all term. There were very different items that were significant in different places. But we did sort of notice that from an interventions perspective, teachers were the critical link. If you're going to intervene in an efficient way, who are you going to intervene with? You're going to intervene with the people who care the most. And that really is teachers. They're doing amazing jobs. One of my colleagues described to me a training once, and they brought all the teachers in to train them, and they had the books to train them with. And the teachers thought the training was great, but the cardboard boxes that the training materials came in, they saw these as a valued classroom resource because they had no other access to cardboard. So for them, that was a real sort of, we can make flashcards with these. That this was what they're working with. So yeah, it's very much a catch-all term.
Just here, sorry. You had a slide up there suggesting you're running some randomised controlled trials now.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, are there ethical considerations there, and if so, how are you handling them?
Yes, there are ethical considerations. So I left the bank in 2015. So what the bank's doing now, I am not fully informed. Certainly there is a big ethical question because we know that a lot of these kids are not learning to read. Kids who are 16 years old in grade 3, this is basically their last chance before they get locked out of the economy. So for a lot of people in these countries, they were like, well, that the intervention is going to work. That basically anything is better than what we've got. Why don't we just go national straight away? And that was very much a balance. The view eventually that was come to with the ministries in question was that an intervention would allow for more efficiency and that this was an important aspect of that. But yeah, I don't think that negates the fact that if we do a baseline and then we come back a year later and we do an intervention and that goes for 2 years, and then maybe in 4 years' time we're ready to deploy nationally and scale up, that's 4 years worth of kids that have missed a chance. I don't think no matter what we decide to do, that negates that this is reality for these children. So yeah, I don't think it was perfect, but that was the decision that was reached.
Hi, I just wanted to ask in terms of two things. Firstly, from a statistical basis, what were the systems that you used to do the modelling? And secondly, were there any academic takeouts? For example, a particular variable was multiplicative, log, linear, or was there any sort of statistical standout from an academic perspective that you observed?
So by tools, do you mean what computer platform? Yeah. Okay. The World Bank has a distinct preference for Stata. So that was the sandpit I was playing in for a long time. And the great thing about Stata is it can do clustered standard errors. Graphs, not so much. In terms of a standout for further research, I think if I was doing a PhD, I would really like to see a robust view of all 4 baseline Papua New Guinean studies. So we did 4 separate baselines in Papua New Guinea because the chances of doing a national representative sample was just not happening. I think we need a robust analysis of what's going on in there. I'd like to see that done in some kind of system method. In terms of what models or what statistics stand out, I think hierarchical clustering has got real potential in this field. I would really like to see some work done on this data using that. I think that would give a real chance for this data to speak. You know, when there's hundreds of variables, I have my opinions on what might work based on data analysis, but I'd really like to see how things cluster, particularly in Laos, which was the biggest sample that we did. We looked at northern region, southern region and central region, and there were specific socioeconomic differences there. I think there is a huge potential for language and language development and language analysis of how this affects how students learn to read. It is almost always socioeconomically linked. So chances are the kid who's from the poorest family in the village isn't speaking fluent English at home. You know, I think also mother tongue education. In Papua New Guinea in particular, there is one province where students are able to start to learn to read in their mother tongue, Kwanua, which is a very specific language to that region, and then they move on to learn English at later levels. And what we found was that compared to other students in other parts of the country, so there's no imputation of causality here, this is just a flat comparison, they could be up to a grade ahead on average. You know, even though they've learnt to read in 2 languages, by learning to read in their mother tongue, a language they understand the best, they have got skills that are transferable across to English when they come to learn to English. So I think mother tongue education would be a critical area for research too.
Just a quick question about how you evaluate the reading score for students.
The-
Pretty much in every country, I'm sure there's a standardized, grade 1 or grade 2 test.
Mhm.
It's not about just use those standardized that has been used in this country as a way to evaluate, other than spend a lot of time designing a questionnaire and
In all the countries I worked on, the only country that had a standardised test was Laos. And that standardised test was deployed at grade 5 and 6. And the reason why the bank chose to intervene in the early grades was they felt that for a lot of these kids, by the time they're 11 or 12 years old, it's too late. You know, a child that learns to read well in the early grades, there's a difference as time goes on. That's why they moved there. Now, standardised testing is not something that's very well known outside the developed world. It's very specific to the country that they're in. So Papua New Guinea, East Timor didn't have that, so it wasn't an option.
Want to take over?
All right. Please join me in thanking STEPH.